Hello. I'm sure all of you, if you're able to watch this through the internet, are very familiar with what goes on in all of the areas relating to how your brain organizes, receives, and develops the materials that you get off the internet. What I want to suggest is some very significant research that was done over the last 10 years or so, which strongly suggests that we're not just dealing with how do you do nice stuff in a more jazzy way. In other words, how do you take materials out of books and digitize them and put them on the computer so you in effect have an electronic book. That's interesting, no big deal. What's really a big deal is that when you begin to use this technology on a regular basis, on a daily basis, which in effect is what's happening with what the group that we call the net generation. The net generation are those who are born in the digitized world. In other words, those people who grew up where the computers were part and parcel of their regular, normal, everyday life. What happens, and we know this through all kinds of physiological testing, we know the neurophysiology of perception more or less, and we're able to indicate and to confirm something along the following lines. When you read a book, and it doesn't matter what's the content in the book, and it doesn't matter whether it goes from right to left or left to right, it doesn't make that much difference because all words, all printed texts, have more or less the same common elements. Namely, they're letters that are then hooked into words, and the words are hooked into sentences, the sentences are hooked into paragraphs, and then you flip the page. Now, that kind of learning is basically the kind of learning that takes place in the left hemisphere of your brain. I imagine that most of you are familiar with the fact that the brain, the gray matter, the wetware we call, is composed of two very similar and yet complementary different kinds of systems, what we call the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And that eventually the kinds of parts of the body that they control are shifted right over here in the back of the neck through what we call the corpus callosum, where there's a bridge that brings the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Now, why I'm mentioning all of this is that through the agency of computers, through the agency of using computers on a regular daily basis, your brain is quite literally being rewired. What that means is that the neural channels are being reorganized in a way that were never existent before. For example, I'm an old guy. I grew up learning or whatever information and knowledge I have is through books, words, lectures, texts. And it's very nice to play around with the computers, and it's very nice to see all the jazz that happens in websites and on the forums, but it's all basically the same words. Okay. What's happening is that creates a certain kind of patterning in your brain which tends to perceive the world as being made up of small pieces of information that you then have to combine, that you then have to interpret. And one of the theories is that this basically is how humanity developed tens of thousands of years ago. So this is what a hunter-gatherer needed to know in order to survive. Since most hunter-gatherers were men, and since this kind of activity is mostly associated with male actions, then what we're dealing with is not only a way you get information, but the social impact of that is that since the introduction of linear reading and written language, particularly in the social context, it has become male-dominant, patriarchal, where women were given less and less control over their own lives. Conversely, what's happening now is that through the use of the extensive use of computer technology, you're now dealing with a right hemisphere type learning. The right hemisphere type learning is more holistic. You see an image. You don't see parts of an image. You see the whole image. You generally are able to manipulate space. So you can deal with outer space, inner space, geographic space, even architectonic space. And it gives you this incredible power. How do you deal with music, which is a unique kind of phenomenon? Now, associated with that gives you a different way of organizing information, then of generating knowledge, and then of assuming, well, what is wisdom? So right hemisphere type learning generally deals with the whole areas of holistic thinking, of being able to see an entire picture, and since this analogous to the hunter-gatherer of the male, this was the female type of occupation, which was basically nurturance. And what is happening now is that more and more of this information is providing a female, yin, feminine type of learning activity. Now, all men and all women deal and have both of these components in them. Some of them are more activated than others. But what's happening to us in our public school system, for example, schools tend to emphasize mostly reading, writing, and arithmetic. Reading, writing, and arithmetic is basically left hemisphere linear activities. So all the other kind of more humane female is simply not used altogether or minimized, or whenever there's some kind of budget crisis, which seems to be the case constantly, and you have to make a choice, then it's always the arts that go by the boards. What we're suggesting now is that there's a major cultural revolution going on. The cultural revolution is being sparked and is being added to by the incremental use of the computer technology, and we are now in what we call an iconic revolution. 100 years ago, for the last couple of hundred years, most information was provided in words. Since the development of film, computer, then television, now computer graphics, and now virtual reality, and now who knows what, more and more information is being encoded in images. What that means is that you're going to have more and more right brain type of activity that interprets that. Now you've got to add another factor into all of this, which makes it more fascinating, more complex, and far more challenging, is that when you read any text, and again it doesn't matter what the text is, you are using light in order to see. You can't see without light, it's obvious. But the question is, what kind of light? So that we know that there's ambient light in a room. The light bounces off all over the place. And then part of that light bounces onto a page. Part of that light that bounces onto a page bounces into your eye. And through an incredibly complex and sophisticated mechanism that we call the rods and the cones and the retina, etc., you're able to decode all of this kind of little squigglies and make sense of it. That is the use of reflected light. And there's a theory that it is this reflected type light that then allows the left hemisphere of the brain to activate itself in a beta mode. A beta mode is a certain electromagnetic spectrum of how the brain operates, and you function in that way, and that's how we've been trained for hundreds of years. There's another way to deal with light. When you watch a television screen, and particularly computer screens, because you watch them more intently because they're interactive, you're not dealing with reflected light. You're dealing with emitted light. Emitted light is light, obviously. However, it's a different kind of light. The quality of that light is different. And the neurophysiology of perception, in other words, the way our anatomy interprets it, is different. And it is interpreted by the right hemisphere of the brain, which then allows you to perceive that in a different kind of brainwave pattern. alpha and theta, for example, which gives you different ways of perception. What we're saying is that if you take a text, doesn't matter what the text is, a paragraph of something, and you read it from a printed page in the normal way that you read a book, that is an experience X. Most people assume that if you take the same text, put it on a screen, and you read the same text, you are going through the same experience. What we want to suggest is that is not the case. You are going through a different experience. And therefore, you are learning different kinds of things. The facets through which your brain interprets whatever it is that you're reading, either in reflected light from a book or emitted light from a screen or in holistic systems, each one is unique. In other words, to use the jargon of the patron saint of the media, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. So it's not only the content of what you're reading, it's how you're reading what you're reading. And that is the most dramatic kind of transformation that is happening. Our goal is, how do you understand this, and how do you use it for the best societal advantage? Thank you very much.